The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek's town square as Margaret Sullivan stood at her kitchen window, watching the crowd gather around the old fountain. 3 days had passed since the water stopped flowing, and with each passing hour, the anxiety in their small Connecticut town grew thicker than the humid August air. She pressed her weathered fingers against the cool glass, knowing what the others didn't, knowing what they'd forgotten in their rush toward progress and prosperity. The fountain had been built in 1923, a monument to the town's founding families who had survived the harsh winter of 1778 together, sharing their last supplies when the Revolutionary War had cut them off from the world. Margaret's grandfather, Thomas Whitfield, had been among the masons who laid each stone with careful precision, embedding within the mortar something more precious than cement, a promise that Willow Creek would always be a place where neighbors looked after neighbors, where no one would face hardship alone. From her window, she could see Jim Patterson, the town selectman, gesturing wildly as he argued with the water department supervisor. His face was red with frustration, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. Just last month, Jim had led the vote to deny funding for the community food pantry, claiming the town couldn't afford charity when property taxes were already too high. Margaret had sat in that town meeting, watching as one by one her neighbors nodded in agreement, their eyes avoiding those of the families who depended on that pantry. She turned from the window and moved slowly through her house, each step deliberate despite the arthritis that made her bones ache. The walls were lined with photographs, decades of Willow Creek's history captured in sepia tones and fading color. There was one of her grandfather standing proudly beside the newly completed fountain, water cascading from its 3 tiers like liquid crystal. Another showed her father, years later, teaching children to make wishes with pennies at its edge. The most recent photo, taken just 5 years ago, showed the fountain during the town's last real celebration, before the factory closed, before the young families started moving away, before neighbor stopped talking to neighbor over property lines and political signs. Margaret pulled on her light cardigan, despite the heat, and reached for her walking cane, a gift from her late husband Robert. He'd understood the weight of the promise too, had spent his life as the town's only doctor, never turning away a patient who couldn't pay. But Robert had been gone for 3 years now, and with him went another voice that reminded people of what Willow Creek used to be. The walk to the town square took her 15 minutes. It used to take 5, but her 82-year-old legs didn't move as they once did. As she approached, she could hear the cacophony of voices, each person offering their theory about the fountain's sudden silence. Maria Santos, who ran the bakery, was insisting it must be the drought, though they'd had plenty of rain in July. Ted Morrison, the hardware store owner, was certain it was a mechanical failure, though no one could find any broken pipes or damaged pumps. The town had already spent thousands of dollars bringing in experts from Hartford, but every test came back the same. There was nothing physically wrong with the fountain. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed, watching as her neighbors grew more agitated with each passing moment. She saw how they stood in small clusters, each group isolated from the others. The long-time residents huddled together, casting suspicious glances at the handful of new families who'd moved in from New York City. The wealthy retirees from the Hill kept their distance from the working families from the South Side. Even the children, who once played together freely in this very square, now stood behind their parents, absorbing the invisible boundaries that had been drawn. The fountain stood in the center of it all, its 3 stone tiers now bone dry, the carved roses and vines that decorated its base seeming to wilt without the water that had brought them to life for nearly a century. The silence where water should have been was deafening, a void that seemed to pull all sound and joy from the square. Margaret approached slowly, her cane tapping against the cobblestones, and as she drew closer, she could see the green moss that had always thrived on the fountain's edges turning brown, crumbling at the slightest touch. Margaret reached out and placed her palm against the warm stone of the fountain's base, feeling the pulse of what was missing. Not just water, but something far more essential. Behind her, the arguing continued, but she closed her eyes and remembered her grandfather's words, spoken to her when she was just 7 years old, standing in this very spot. Water flows where hearts are open, little one. This fountain is more than stone and pipe. It's the physical manifestation of our promise to each other. Mrs. Sullivan, a young voice interrupted her thoughts. She opened her eyes to find Danny Chen, the 10-year-old son of the family who'd opened the new Chinese restaurant on Main Street. His parents had faced nothing but cold shoulders since arriving 6 months ago, with many long-time residents resenting the change to their traditional downtown. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She smiled at him. This boy who still possessed the kindness that was draining from Willow Creek like water from broken vessels. "I'm fine, Danny. Just remembering." "Oh." She looked past him to where his mother stood anxiously near the edge of the square, clearly worried about her son talking to strangers, but too polite to intervene. Margaret waved to her, a gentle gesture that seemed to surprise the woman. "My mom says the fountain is important to the town," Danny said, his dark eyes curious. "She says in China, water features bring good fortune and harmony. Is that why everyone's so upset?" "Something like that," Margaret replied, noting how Jim Patterson was now on his phone, probably calling more experts, throwing money at a problem that money couldn't solve. She'd tried to tell him 3 days ago, when the water first stopped, but he'd dismissed her concerns as elderly superstition. Now, watching the town fragment further with each passing hour, she knew she couldn't wait any longer. That afternoon, Margaret began her work. She started with Sarah Williams, the young mother who lived 2 houses down. Sarah had been struggling since her husband lost his job at the factory, but pride kept her from asking for help. Margaret knocked on her door with a casserole and a lie about having made too much food. "I hate to see it go to waste," she said, and Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the dish. They stood in the doorway talking for 20 minutes. About Sarah's children, about the challenges of making ends meet, about the fear of being judged by neighbors who seemed to have everything figured out. Next, she visited Frank Jameson, the Vietnam veteran who lived alone at the end of Maple Street. Frank had isolated himself after a dispute with his neighbors over his unkempt yard, and the town had essentially written him off as a cranky hermit. Margaret brought him a batch of cookies and sat on his porch, listening as he talked about his struggles with mobility, how hard it was to maintain the property when his back gave him such trouble. By the end of their conversation, she'd arranged for Danny Chen and 2 other neighborhood boys to help with his yard work, not as charity, but in exchange for Frank teaching them about the vegetable garden he'd once maintained. As the sun began to set, Margaret made her way to the Patel family's convenience store. They'd been in Willow Creek for 2 years, but were still treated as outsiders by many. She bought milk she didn't need and struck up a conversation with Priya Patel about the woman's mother, who was visiting from India. Margaret mentioned her own interest in Indian cooking, a small fib that led to an invitation for tea the next day. Priya's surprise at this simple gesture of interest revealed how starved she was for connection. That evening, Margaret sat in her living room exhausted but determined. She pulled out her old address book and began making phone calls. To Reverend Jackson at the Methodist Church, suggesting a community dinner that weekend. To Rosa Martinez, the high school principal, proposing a student volunteer program. To her own nephew Michael, who worked at the bank, asking if he could review the Williamses' refinancing application with fresh eyes. Each call was a small stone thrown into still water, creating ripples she hoped would spread. But she knew phone calls weren't enough. The fountain stood dry in the square, a testament to how far they'd drifted from their founding promise. Margaret pulled out a yellow legal pad and began to write, her arthritis making each word a small act of determination. She wrote about the history of Willow Creek, about the harsh winter that had nearly destroyed their ancestors, about how sharing their meager resources had not only saved them, but had created something sacred, a commitment to ensure no one would ever face hardship alone again. She wrote about her grandfather and the other founders who had built the fountain as a symbol of that promise, how they'd believed that as long as the community honored their commitment to each other, the water would flow. It wasn't magic or superstition, it was cause and effect, the physical world responding to the spiritual health of the community. When people stopped seeing each other's humanity, when they chose isolation over connection, when they let fear override compassion, the fountain reflected that spiritual drought. The next morning, Margaret made copies of her letter at the library, ignoring the curious looks from Beth, the librarian. She then began her pilgrimage through Willow Creek, sliding letters under doors and into mailboxes, each one a seed of remembrance. Some people read them immediately, standing in their doorways with furrowed brows. Others would find them later, perhaps when the message might resonate more deeply. She didn't wait for responses, didn't knock on doors to explain. The letter would have to speak for itself. By noon, she'd reached the town square again. The crowd around the fountain had thinned, but there were still officials there, now discussing the possibility of simply replacing the entire structure. The thought made Margaret's heart ache. They would tear down nearly a century of history because they couldn't understand that some problems couldn't be solved with bulldozers and construction crews. "Excuse me," she said loudly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. The men turned to look at her, Jim Patterson, Ted Morrison, and a contractor from Hartford she didn't recognize. "Before you make any decisions about destroying this fountain, I think the town deserves to know its real history." Jim's face showed his impatience. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've been over this. We appreciate the historical significance, but we have a practical problem here." "You have more than a practical problem," Margaret interrupted, something she rarely did. "You have a community that's forgotten how to be a community. This fountain was built on a promise, Mr. Patterson, a promise that we would take care of each other, that no one in Willow Creek would face their struggles alone. When's the last time you checked on your neighbor? When's the last time any of us chose compassion over comfort?" Ted Morrison scoffed. "With all due respect, Mrs. Sullivan, mystical promises don't fix plumbing problems." "No," Margaret agreed, "but keeping real promises might." She looked around the square, noticing that others had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of quiet Margaret Sullivan speaking up. She saw Sarah Williams there, holding her daughter's hand. Frank Jameson had hobbled over from Maple Street, the Chens stood near their restaurant, and the Patels had emerged from their store. "Yesterday," Margaret continued, her voice carrying across the square, "I watched this town argue and point fingers, everyone looking for someone else to blame for our dry fountain. But I also saw Danny Chen offer to help an old woman he barely knew. I saw Sarah Williams share her last $5 with a homeless man everyone else ignored. I saw Priya Patel quietly leave groceries on Frank Jameson's porch when she thought no one was looking." She paused, making eye contact with each person she named. "The promise isn't completely broken, it's just been forgotten." An uncomfortable silence settled over the square. Then, unexpectedly, it was broken by Maria Santos from the bakery. "The Williamses' refrigerator broke last week," she said quietly. "I've been sending home day-old bread and pastries, telling them I'd rather give it away than throw it out. I thought I was the only one who noticed they were struggling." "I've been mowing Mr. Jameson's front yard at night," admitted Kyle Brooks, a teenager who worked at the hardware store. "I didn't want him to feel bad about accepting help." One by one, stories began to emerge, small acts of kindness that had been happening in the shadows, as if compassion had become something to be embarrassed about rather than celebrated. Margaret watched as neighbors looked at each other with new eyes, seeing not strangers or burdens, but fellow travelers on a difficult journey. Jim Patterson cleared his throat, his face reddening. This is all very touching, but it doesn't explain the fountain. He was interrupted by a sound that made everyone freeze, a gurgle followed by a splash. All heads turned toward the fountain as a small trickle of water emerged from the top tier, weak and uncertain, but undeniably there. The crowd moved closer, watching in amazement as the trickle grew stronger, water beginning to cascade down to the second tier. "That's impossible," the Hartford contractor muttered, pulling out his phone to call his team. "We checked everything. There was no water in the system." But Margaret wasn't surprised. She watched as her neighbors began to really see each other, perhaps for the first time in years. She saw Jim Patterson awkwardly approach the Patels, extending his hand in introduction. She saw Maria Santos invite Sarah Williams into the bakery, probably to discuss a part-time job. She saw Frank Jameson teaching Danny Chen how to test if the fountain water was clean, the boy's eager questions bringing a rare smile to the veteran's weathered face. Over the next hours, as word spread through Willow Creek about the fountain's mysterious revival, the town square filled with people. But this gathering was different from the anxious crowd of the previous days. There was a tentative quality to it, like people learning to walk again after a long illness. Conversations sparked between neighbors who hadn't spoken in months. Children were allowed to play together while their parents put aside old grievances, at least temporarily. Margaret found herself at the center of it all, not as a leader but as a bridge. She introduced people who'd lived in the same town for years but had never met. She translated concerns between the old-timers and the newcomers, helping each side see that they wanted the same things: safety for their children, dignity in their work, a sense of belonging. She watched the water grow stronger with each connection made, though she was careful not to point out the correlation. Some truths were better discovered than taught. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Reverend Jackson appeared with several folding tables from the church. "Seems like a good night for that community dinner," he said, smiling at Margaret. Maria Santos immediately offered to bring bread and pastries from the bakery. The Chens volunteered to make stir-fry with vegetables from Frank Jameson's garden. The Patels brought out samosas they'd been preparing for the next day. Within an hour, the town square had transformed into an impromptu feast. Margaret sat on a bench near the fountain, watching the scene unfold. The water was flowing fully now, its sound providing a musical backdrop to the conversations and laughter that filled the square. She thought about her grandfather, wondering if he could see this moment, if he knew that his great-granddaughter had helped keep the promise alive. "Mrs. Sullivan." Jim Patterson stood beside her bench, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more humble. "I owe you an apology. I thought you were just a superstitious old woman holding on to fairy tales." "And now?" Margaret asked, not unkindly. He looked at the fountain, then at the gathering crowd. "Now I think you might be the wisest person in Willow Creek. That letter you wrote, I read it 3 times. My father used to talk about the old days, when everyone knew everyone, when the town felt like a family. I thought that was just nostalgia, that those days were gone forever." "Nothing's gone forever," Margaret replied. "It just gets buried sometimes, waiting for someone to remember and dig it back up." As the evening progressed, plans began to form organically. The Rotary Club would restart the community garden they'd abandoned 5 years ago. The high school would begin a senior companion program, pairing teenagers with elderly residents who needed help with errands and technology. The churches would coordinate to ensure the food pantry never ran empty. Jim Patterson, transformed by the evening's revelations, pledged to propose a new town budget that prioritized community programs over cosmetic improvements. But Margaret knew the real test would come tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. It was easy to make promises in the glow of a magical evening. It was harder to keep them when the magic faded and daily life resumed. She thought about the fountain, flowing strongly now, and wondered how many times it might run dry again before the lesson truly stuck. Danny Chen appeared at her side, offering her a plate of food his mother had prepared. "Mrs. Sullivan, my mum wants to know if the fountain will keep flowing now." Margaret looked at the boy's earnest face, then at his mother, who was deep in conversation with Sarah Williams and Maria Santos, apparently planning some kind of international food festival. "That depends on us, Danny. The fountain is like a mirror. It reflects what we put into the world. If we remember to take care of each other, to see each other as family rather than strangers, then yes, I think it will keep flowing." The boy nodded solemnly, as if receiving ancient wisdom, which in a way he was. He ran back to his mother, and Margaret heard him translating her words into Mandarin. Mrs. Chen looked over and smiled, a gesture that crossed all language barriers. As the evening wound down and people began to clean up together, another small miracle in a town where everyone usually rushed home to their private lives, Margaret rose from her bench. The walk home would be slow, but she didn't mind. She had done what she could to remind Willow Creek of its promise. The rest was up to them. She paused at the edge of the square for one last look at the fountain. In the lamplight, the water sparkled like liquid stars, each drop carrying the possibility of renewal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between isolation and connection, between fear and love. But tonight, at least, the fountain flowed, and Willow Creek remembered what it meant to be a community. The promise had been renewed, written not in stone and mortar this time, but in the deliberate choice of neighbors to see each other, to help each other, to remember that they were all part of something larger than themselves. And Margaret Sullivan, keeper of the old promise and midwife to the new one, walked home through streets that felt alive again with possibility, her grandfather's legacy, secured for at least one more generation.